Dear participants, welcome to the EFSA webinar on public access to documents. It is a great pleasure to host this webinar and to see how many participants are connected today with us. First of all, please allow me to introduce myself. My name is Luisa Venier. I am the team leader of the team of Access and Independence in the Legal Affairs Services, which is in charge of the handling of initial applications for public access to documents, which we refer to as PAD application, PAD applications. I would like to introduce to you the speakers of today's webinar. Mr. Dirk Detken, Head of the Legal Affairs Services at EFSA, Citlali Pintado, Legal Officer at EFSA, and Philip Answorth, Legal Officer at EFSA. There are 3 additional staff members of EFSA that are going to support us during this webinar. Marie-Lafina Pochet, who will be responsible for sharing and go through the presentation prepared. Benedetta Lavitola and Arnaud Jaume, who will be responsible for monitoring the questions you may submit during the presentation. The main purpose of this webinar is to present to you the main features put in place by EFSA to lean and facilitate the processing of PAD applications at EFSA. This event is being handled through Teams Live, and it will be recorded. The webinar will be held in English, and we recommend you to submit any questions you may have in English to ensure they can be quickly addressed. You can submit questions in writing in the Q&A tool as soon as the event starts, related to each ongoing presented topic. Please note that depending on the number of questions, EFSA may not be able to reply to all of them, although we are convinced that most of the questions will be addressed directly by the presentations of all the speakers. Please also note that questions out of scope will not be dealt with, and you can always submit your questions through Ask EFSA via Connect.EFSA if something is relevant to EFSA, but not directly relevant to the topic addressed in this webinar. As indicated in the agenda of this meeting, we will start by briefly introducing the PAD process, the public access to document process, and the relevant regulatory and legal framework. Then we will provide you with some information on how to use Connect.EFSA, the online platform, to submit your PAD applications. As a third step, we will present to you the PAD guidance prepared by EFSA to support PAD applicants in the submission of their PAD applications. We will go through the different steps involved in the processing, including an insightful information on the tools supporting the process. Lastly, we will present to you few regular issues that, in our experience, may be encountered during the processing of PAD applications that are also being clarified in the guidance for PAD applicants. As I said before, note that Q&A session is organized at the end of our presentations, but you can always submit your questions at any time during the different presentations via the chat. I would like now to pass the floor to Dirk Detken, the head of unit, who is going to present you the interplay between proactive and reactive transparency at EFSA. Dirk, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Luisa, and good morning, dear participants. It's my pleasure to welcome you also to this webinar about ultimately transparency. It's a crucial moment for EFSA to talk about transparency because we are at the beginning of the application of a new law, and this law is, of course, the EU food law, the so-called General Food Law, Regulation 178 of 2002. And this regulation, which is, of course, EFSA's founding act, was amended in 2019 by the Regulation 1381 of 2019, the so-called Transparency Regulation, and that has significantly affected the functioning of EFSA. Now, the fact that the entry into force of the new Transparency Regulation is the first targeted revision of the General Food Law in almost 20 years shows us how relevant the risk assessment principles of the General Food Law are still today to address what initially, and you know that of course, started as a crisis of confidence into the EU food safety system, and BSE of course is always the most prominent example of that one, and which EFSA addressed successfully inter alia with transparency and independence as guidance principles of its operations in the last, we can call it 20 years now. However, the expectations of society have moved on, evolved over time, and EFSA has reacted in the margins of its legal framework. But nevertheless, the society demanded even more transparency in the data and in the process of EFSA, more than the legal framework actually allowed. And the legislator has responded to that need by actually reviewing and expanding the mandate of EFSA in the area of transparency. What of course is also a fact is that there's no clear definition of transparency. It's fair to say that it depends very much on the context, namely how it is used and the function it's supposed to deliver. It's always linked to very, very important administrative questions, and some of them we're going to address today. It's always linked to the how much access is given, the completeness, the accuracy, the timeliness of the information, and of course, very much also what the citizen can actually do when the citizen has got the feeling that actually access was not sufficiently provided. And there's no question that for EFSA, the transparency in the context of the EU food safety system is about creating a high degree of clarity and openness about the scientific decisions we are making here at EFSA in order to consolidate or create the confidence of the citizen in these decisions. So at EFSA, we should create actually trust in the EU food safety system. That's part of our genetic code it was put into our cradle. And this is the reason why openness and transparency are basically key ingredients of us doing our job, of actually fulfilling our accountability. Without being transparent, we actually don't do our work at EFSA. And many of these new transparency features that are in the new legislation are about automatization of proactive transparency, which is not the subject matter of today. But the TR, the Transparency Regulation, has also led to a revamp of the procedures of what we call the reactive transparency, which is the access to document, the Regulation 1049 of 2001, which is the subject matter of today. And today we are proud to present to you the outcome of the learnings that we had over the last years in order to make the process more effective. When it comes to the relationship between proactive, so the new transparency, the end of the transparency regulation, and the reactive transparency, it needs to be seen. We're not entirely sure how this is going to pan out in the future. There's an obvious difference because the proactive one is the process which we just started to implement, whilst of course on the reactive, we have many, many years of experience together with you, with the stakeholders. And today, as I said, we are ready to present to you the learnings of this experience in order to make the process more efficient and effective. We actually believe at EFSA that these two, reactive and proactive transparency, is going to coexist in the future for two simple reasons. First of all, the legal frameworks are, of course, not exactly the same. While they're both targeting transparency, the workflows are different, the exceptions provided in the law are different. So that leads to two separate legal worlds, which have its own relevance by themselves. And another reason is that in the area of reactive transparency, so the subject matter of today, the public access to document, there are, of course, numerous European Court or European Ombudsman case law developed over the years, which relates to the interpretation of the exceptions with regard to that specific legal framework. And this body of experience also coming from the court or the European Ombudsman, of course, is something which, due to the fact that it's a distinctive legal framework, cannot be transferred easily into the proactive world. So we believe that the reactive transparency is going to continue to be a very important factor of us living up to our accountability. All this just to say that it's very important to have revamped the procedures of this Regulation 1049 and its application, and to have a webinar today in order to present to you actually the outcome of these adjustments and reflections on the process. So I thank you very much in advance for being here, for taking the time to listen to us on this very important aspect for EFSA. And I hope that you will take some really useful information with you, that together we will make this process even more effective than it has been in the past. And with that, I hand over back to Louisa and her team, who are, of course, the people who have prepared all this in a lot of hard work. And I'm looking forward to the session. Thank you very much. And back to you, Louisa.
Thank you, Dirk. Thank you, Dirk. indeed, the PAD process is an essential component of the implementation of the transparency principle at EFSA. Furthermore, and referring to the legal framework you were mentioning just before, public access to documents held by institutions, agencies, and bodies has historically been a cornerstone of the fundamental rights of European citizens. The right of individuals to access documents held by institutions is enshrined in the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union and the Charter of Fundamental Rights. With respect to the concrete processing of PAD applications, the legal framework of reference, as you mentioned, Dirk, is Regulation 1049 on public access to documents, which we refer as PAD regulation, and provides the principles and conditions governing the access to documents held by EFSA. And it's applied to EFSA via its funding regulation, the Regulation 178, as it has been amended by the Transparency Regulation. Then what do we have? We have a management board decision by means of which we adopted the practical arrangements on public access to documents posted in our website. And then we have a standard operating procedure, which is also published on our website and which details from a procedural perspective the processing of PAD applications at EFSA. If a requested document concerns environmental information, the PAD regulation is applied in conjunction with Regulation 1367, the Aarhus Regulation on access to environmental information. Moreover, sectoral legislation is also taken into account when processing PAD applications, depending on the type of documents requested and the area of work of EFSA. I would like to share with you the way the PAD processing is managed at EFSA. The processing of PAD applications, of initial PAD applications, is centralized in the team, as you can see in the yellow icon. It's the team of Access and Independence, which is part of the Legal Affairs Services, which daily liaises and cooperates, of course, with the concerned units. So those units that are holding the document that in the scope of the PAD applications. Furthermore, in order to ensure an independent review of the decisions taken on the initial PAD applications, confirmatory applications, if the PAD applicants are unsatisfied with EFSA reply and they want to challenge it, they can submit such a challenge to the head of unit of the Legal Affairs Services, Dirk Detken. Now, I would like to share with you now the PAD processing at glance with the support of this workflow. As you see, is rather complex. And we will then go furthermore later on through the different steps more in depth. So the PAD processing, it's rather complex. As defined by the applicable legal framework recalled earlier, it includes several steps and, as you can see, involves different types of interaction. There is an internal interaction within EFSA's unit that allows, first, to identify the scope of the PAD applications. Second, to identify the documents subject to the PAD application. Identify whether the documents requested, they originate from EFSA or they originate from third parties. And then finally, the interaction is meant to assess the accessibility of the requested documents. There are interactions with the PAD applicants in the sense that these are all the communications with the PAD applicants that are foreseen during the processing. First of all, we acknowledge receipt of the PAD applications. We extend the time limits to respond to the PAD applications, if any. We clarify if there is need to clarify, and then we reply. Finally, there is an interaction with the document owners in case the documents requested do not originate from EFSA, and this can be third parties or member states, which, as we'll explain later on, there will be a special focus on this. It's a rather resource-intensive process. So when EFSA receives a PAD application, it first identifies the documents requested, proceeds with the assessment of the accessibility of the requested documents in accordance with the legal framework. In this respect, where the documents are originating from a third party, EFSA will consult the document owner to assess whether any of the exception to disclosure applies. And we will see further on what this means. EFSA will then take the final decision on the accessibility of the requested documents and notify its decision to the document owner. And where it has concluded that document can be accessed, it will manually sanitize the document accordingly if there is any information contained therein that deserves protection. Finally, always as a part of the process at glance, I would like to share with you, with the next slide, few statistics collected over the years. You can see the trend. We had a rather stable number of PAD applications processed over some years, from 2015 to 2019. Then we experienced a rather steep increase over the years as of 2019, where we arrived at 255 PAD applications processed in 2022, which is our record. So these are more than one PAD applications processed per day, received and processed per day, working day. In this context, and in order to enhance the process and facilitate the submission of PAD applications, EFSA put in place and relies on different learning mechanisms and tools that support the process and aim at optimizing the handling of PAD applications by EFSA. These tools first include Connect.EFSA, which is a specific portal that may be used by PAD applicants to submit their applications online via a specific form by connecting to EFSA website. In such cases, the Connect.EFSA will be used by EFSA to communicate with the PAD applicants at each stage of the processing of their requests. Furthermore, taking into account the time limits for the processing of PAD applications, EFSA worked on a system that relies on the statistical data collected throughout the last 8-9 years that allows to support the estimation on the number of documents that can be processed within the mandatory deadlines set out by the PAD regulation. Lastly, we are working to an additional tool that is currently being discussed and is under preparation, which supports the automatic creation of a list of documents falling within the scope of PAD applications to be shared with the PAD applicants to serve the purpose of swiftly identify the documents subject to the PAD applications. On these last two features, I will spend some more words later when addressing the details of the processing of PAD applications and the presentation of the guidance for PAD applicants. But now I will pass the floor to Citlali, who will provide you with full insight of the processing of PAD applications via Connect.EFSA. Citlali, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Luisa. Welcome everybody from my side as well. My name is Citlali Pintado. I'm a legal officer, and I'm also working in the Legal Affairs Services on the PAD processing. I will now present to you how you can submit PAD applications from the EFSA's website, accessing this new Connect.EFSA platform. We can go to the next slide. Okay, from this overview, you can see how the process was integrated in the tool. During the past years, we have worked to integrate the processing foreseen in the legislation into an IT tool accessible from EFSA's website to all the public outside. The purpose of this new tool is to allow EFSA to handle your PAD applications in a centralized manner in one single tool and ensuring a thorough monitoring of PAD applications being processed by EFSA, while also allowing PAD applicants to better follow the processing of their requests. The processing of PAD applications by means of this new portal starts, as you can see on the left, from the community users, so the requesters, authenticated or not, submitting an access to document request via the tool. The application for public access to documents is then automatically notified to EFSA and is received by the Legal Affairs Services, which is in charge of handling the PAD applications and who will then communicate internally with the other services that are in charge of the processing the request. The Legal Affairs Services will then contact the concerned unit and relevant staff with a view to assessing the PAD application and in particular the accessibility of the documents falling in the scope of the PAD application. When needed, EFSA will consult the document owner, which is on the top, via the tool to keep track of all communications linked to the same request. Therefore, this new allows for EFSA to perform all different steps relating to the PAD processing by means of a centralized tool and have a collaborative space to interact internally and keep track of the process of your PAD application. During the assessment process and at each step of the process, EFSA is able to communicate with you via this tool. Next slide. Here you can see the actors of the process. As you can see from this slide, there are 3 types of users in this tool, depending on whether you choose to register when you access the portal to submit your PAD application or not. These 3 actors are called community users and are defined by the roles and access rights depending on the profile and the account when you submit a PAD application. We encourage you in EFSA Connect to register so you can become what we call an authenticated user, because like this you can see you can see the progress of your PAD application and it will give you a better overview of the status of your PAD application. So you will be able to see each step of the progress and the processing of your request. You will also be able to contact EFSA via the comment section available only for authenticated users. The second category of community users are called non-authenticated users. Those are not registered in the system, but can always submit a PAD application. As a non-authenticated user, PAD applicants will not be able to keep track of their personal details or see the PAD application submitted, nor they will have the possibility of visualize the progress of the processing of their request. And they will not be able, in fine, to contact EFSA directly via the tool. So to contact EFSA, they will be in the need to submit a new request, which will be delinked in the tool from the initial request. That's why we encourage you to register in the tool, so we can continue the communication on the same request with the same number and in the same window. Lastly, there are the internal users, which are the EFSA staff that are handling from the back end the tool. Next slide. How can you access this new portal? So the access to Connect.EFSA platform, you must go to the EFSA's web page and click on the Connect tab on top of the landing page of EFSA's website, close to the EFSA portal and the EFSA journal tabs. Next slide. Once you have access this portal, in the new portal, there is a section called Ask a Question, which is the entry point allowing the public to submit questions to EFSA. The queries are then dispatched to different services in EFSA, depending on the purpose of the query and the area selected in the online form. It is the platform we use to manage answers, interact, and collect questions submitted by the public. These Ask a Question services are available since January 2021. As you can see from this new portal, there are other services included there. There are the Register for portal. This is the platform for food business operators for submitting also general pre-submission advice. There is also the public consultation tool, which is integrated from this Connect.EFSA platform. And this allows to actively participate to EFSA's risk assessment by submitting comments via this tool to open public consultations, but it allows us also to visualize the closed public consultations. And then in fine, there is the Ask a Question service, which is on which you can submit your PAD applications. In this landing page of the portal, you can see on the right of the page, of the bottom of the page, the possibility to register to the tool or log in case you have already registered. Once you access the Ask a Question green box, an online form will appear automatically that you can see in the next slide. Under Ask a Question, there are, as I said before, 4 channels at your disposal that you can see under the area section here underneath. If you select General Question about EFSA, the service will direct you to the Ask EFSA service, which is centralized by the Engagement and External Relations Unit. And this is to submit general requests for information on the overall functioning of EFSA. Instead, if you want to submit questions relating to the risk assessment of regulated products which are handled by EFSA Front Desk and Workforce Planning Unit, you need to select questions about scientific applications dossiers process. These are questions that you can submit on food feed domains where EFSA receives applications dossier for placing on the market food feed substances, products, or claims. Then there is also the possibility via this same tool to submit questions on EFSA's career and recruitment opportunities. If you select this item in the area section, your request will be transferred to the Human Capital Services. Instead here, if you want to submit a request for access to documents, you need to tick on the box to select the option Public Access to Document in this area section. As you can see from this Ask a Question platform, in the online form, you can see that there are mandatory fields that are marked with a red asterisk in the form. We highly encourage you to, apart from the mandatory fields, to be as clear as possible when filling in these fields, and therefore to fill in as many fields as possible. In particular, we encourage you to always refer to the question number when feasible of EFSA's output, as it is considerably facilitating the work of EFSA in identifying the documents that you are requesting. So please always put the link to the website output or to the document in relation to which you would like to access documents. You can also upload documents should you prefer to join a letter with your PAD application. Once submitted, you will receive automatically a confirmation of the submission of your request. And you will have a number that will be assigned to your PAD application. The application for public access to documents is automatically notified also to EFSA and is received by us in the LA unit. However, should you not click on public access to document and you are seeking for documents, as I mentioned before, your request will not be received by us, but by another service, as explained before. It is important you identified what is the purpose of your request in order to properly direct to the competent service in EFSA your query. We are currently working to make this online form even more user-friendly. Next slide. So as I said before, why to register? We encourage you to register in the system and to become an authenticated user, because this is what you will be able to visualize. Yeah, by registering when submitted your request, you will allow to better visualize and follow the status, and all your PAD applications will be accessible from one entry point. Here you can see an example of the list of PAD application submitter or any other query you submitted to EFSA, ongoing or closed. By clicking on them, you will be able to see all the details of the progress of each request and communicate with EFSA directly. So you can see it's easier to have an overview of all the requests, and you have one single point to access all of them. Next slide. Now we will show you a short video that is summarizing what I just explained on how this tool is accessible and how you can submit your request for access to documents. This video is available from EFSA's website. Next slide. Now we can play the video.
To file a request for public access to documents on the portal, you can either log in or submit your request as a guest. If you do not have an account, click on Ask a Question and fill out your contact details. The fields with a red asterisk are required to be filled out. As area, select the Public Access to Documents option. This will direct your query to the team in charge of processing applications for access to documents or data. The application number can be filled out but is not mandatory. It can be useful to identify an EFSA output relating to the documents or data of interest. Select your affiliation. The type of question is mandatory to be filled out. Select the topic of your request from the drop-down list. Insert your request in the body field. It is important to check the box to confirm that you are a new citizen, as the process is different for non-EU citizens or residents. Please read and accept the privacy statement and click on Next to submit your application. You can now see the summary of your application. After submitting your question, you will receive updates via email. Log into the portal with your EFSA account before asking your question. Click on the New Request button to file a new application for access to documents. Please check the frequently asked questions before filing your question. Fill out the required fields, which are marked with a red asterisk. Fill out your subject, affiliation, type of question and insert your request. If you are an EU citizen or resident, make sure to check this box as the process for non-EU citizens or residents is different. Log into the portal and navigate to My Open Requests and My Closed Requests. Click on your request to see the details. You can see the status of your application on this page. If your application is indicated as being in progress, this means that its processing has started and you will find the deadline on this page. You will receive emails alerting you that an action has occurred, the details of which can be consulted from the portal. When clicking on your request, you will see its latest status. Here you will see the deadline, latest comments or questions, and find the link to the requested documents when they are released. If the request has been closed but not yet answered to your satisfaction, you can file a confirmatory application. To do so, log into the portal and go to My Closed Requests. Select the closed application to submit a confirmatory application using the button Confirmatory Application. If you are not logged in, make sure you fill out the number of the parent application, which is the initial application. Fill in the fields as required and follow up on the request either via email or logging into the portal with your EFSA account, and navigating to the My Open Requests section.
Okay, so as you see from the video, there are many advantages. There are many advantages for you to use Connect.EFSA. The advantages for you as external users are that you can always contact EFSA, so you can stay connected with us. The tool also gives you a holistic experience of PAD applications and queries submitted, interconnecting all the elements and information from past and current queries. And it's a single access point for all contact you may need to have with EFSA. It keeps the history of your queries and interactions with EFSA. You can easily access them without having the need to search in other tools or folders. Internally for us also, the tools has many benefits because it allows EFSA to monitor all incoming requests and to assign the request within the team to a case handler. and to also involve other teams in EFSA and relevant staff members to assess and process PAD applications. This tool allows also us to receive notifications from the tool to control the status of the request and reassign the request to another service if the request does not qualify as a PAD application. It is also useful for us to keep all centralized information on PAD applications via this tool, since it allows to create statistics and reports at the end of the year. Now you have a better understanding of how to submit PAD applications via Connect.EFSA. I will pass now the floor back to my colleague Luisa, who will present to you the new document we have produced to better guide you on how EFSA processes your PAD applications. Thank you very much for your attention. Luisa, back to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Citlali. Thank you very much, Citlali, for this insightful explanation and information on how to submit PAD applications via Connect.EFSA. Now, indeed, as we mentioned earlier, in line with the practical arrangements following the Transparency Regulation, EFSA developed a guidance for PAD applicants that is going to be published on EFSA website in the next weeks, along with the publication of this webinar video. The PAD guidance, the guidance for PAD applicants, provides details on how to submit PAD applications on the different steps of the processing of the different PAD applications. This guidance aims at increasing the transparency on how the PAD applications are processed by EFSA, and moreover, at supporting PAD applicants in submitting their PAD applications. How? The guidance is structured in questions and answers, divided in 4 main sections, which reflect the workflow for processing PAD applications. So, how to submit a PAD applications, how the application is processed, how the decision of EFSA is received, and how the decision of EFSA can be challenged. These are the 4 sections. Of course, given the limited time of this webinar, we cannot go through all the questions and answers outlined in the guidance. As I said, it will be published very soon. And therefore, I would like to focus on those which I believe might be of more relevance for you and for which we have some insightful information to be shared with you, because they are more complex or more to the point for the PAD applicants. We start with the submission phase. Allow me to recall that you can submit a PAD application via Connect.EFSA, as Citlali explained, but also by sending an email to the functional mailbox, which is EFSA Public Access to Documents at efsaeuropa.eu. We will post it in the chat. You can submit your PAD application in one of the 24 official languages of the European Union. In this case, we will engage with you to inform you that we will provide you with our communications in English, provided that you agree, and that at any time of the processing, you can ask for the translation of our communications to you. We encourage you, when you submit a PAD application to EFSA, to try to be as precise as possible in your request, in indicating the documents you request access to, for example, including in your application relevance to the relevant scientific output, or indicated if you're interested only in a specific section of a document. And I want to underline this aspect because there are occasions where the PAD applications are not that specific. You might be interested only on a specific section of a dossier or a specific year of reference for one specific data requested, while you generically ask for the whole dossier or the whole years. So we encourage to be as precise as possible for your benefit to receive a swifter reply. At any moment, you can always specify or clarify your PAD applications after its submission, and at any time by sending an email to our functional mailbox or via the Connect.EFSA tool by submitting a comment. In any event, EFSA will keep regular contact with you after the submission of PAD applications. Regular contact, what does it mean? It means, for instance, that of course we acknowledge receipt of your request automatically or very swiftly upon receipt in the functional mailbox. We send requests for clarifications if needed, when necessary, and we keep you updated on the status of your PAD application, both via Connect.EFSA or via the functional mailbox and emails. Then, with regards to the processing, can a PAD application that concerns a very long document or relates to a very large number of documents, or that concerns a very complex case, be processed within the time limits foreseen in the PAD regulation? We shall consider the following. When a PAD application concerns a very long document or very large number of documents, or it's very complex because the case entails, for instance, the consultation with multiple actors, that application highly likely cannot be addressed within the relevant time limits. What are the relevant time limits? The PAD regulation foresees that a PAD application shall be answered, or the institution shall grant access to PAD applicants within 15 working days. This can be exceptionally be extended to additional 15 working days. So overall, the time limits are 30 working days. We aim at replying to all PAD applications within the time limits foreseen in the PAD regulations. Again, can all types of PAD applications be answered within such a time limits? As I said before, if a PAD application, for instance, ask about a request for accessing a considerable number of documents originating from 10 different document owners, if you just go back and think about the PAD processing cycle I described earlier, with multiple internal and external interactions, which encompasses the identification of the documents, the retrieval of the contact details in case the documents originate from a third-party document owner. Then we need to process a case-by-case assessment, which is required by law to assess individually, case-by-case, a specific examination of all the documents requested. You see how difficult it is to respond to a PAD applications of a very complex nature relating to high number of documents with multiple actors within the time limits. This considering that the decision whether or not the documents are accessible, so the accessibility always lies within EFSA. We shall take into consideration the consultation outcome that, as my colleague Philip will explain to you later, is a resource-intensive step. Hence, in a case like this example, EFSA will seek to reach an agreement with you, with the PAD applicants, by means of the so-called fair solution, which will focus on the material scope of your PAD application. What does it mean? How is this translated? Implies that EFSA will contact you, asking you to possibly clarify the material scope of your PAD application in a way that allows EFSA to process your PAD application within the mandatory time limits. In order to support reaching the fair solution, where appropriate, EFSA will prepare a list of documents. We are working hard to have that automatized, which will be shared with you in order to clarify which are the priority documents that you wish to receive first and within the 30 working days. The feature I mentioned earlier, providing support, providing a read across of the statistical data we collected over the last 8 years, may support EFSA in assessing the number of documents that can be processed within the mandatory deadlines. So upon receipt of your feedback, we will contact you with a proposal for fair solutions, possibly with the support, very likely with the support of a list of documents saying, your PAD application concerns 100 documents amounting to 5,000 pages for which we shall consult 10 document owners. This is a list of the documents concerned. Could you please better specify what are your priority documents that you want to receive at first? Upon receipt of your feedback, EFSA will process your PAD applications accordingly, so within a reduced and clarified scope. This means that EFSA will assess the accessibility of the documents that you indicated as priority documents that you want to receive first. They will be assessed in light of the PAD regulation and the legal framework applicable. And then EFSA will take a decision on the accessibility or not of these documents. And this is very important. Should you maintain an interest in receiving additional documents on top of the priority documents received within the mandatory deadline, you can always reply by submitting another PAD applications. You can say, I maintain also my interest in receiving also these documents, and we will process as an additional PAD applications accordingly. Another important aspect, crucial aspect, I would say, of the processing of PAD applications is represented by the assessment of the accessibility and the applicability of the exceptions to disclosure. When EFSA receives a PAD application, it performs a concrete and individual assessment of the information contained in the documents falling within the scope of your PAD application, and assesses whether the documents are fully accessible or if they deserve protection. Protection in full, not be disclosed at all, or protection in part. They are partially potentially releasable and partially to be protected, because the information contained therein falls within one or more of the exceptions to disclosure set out in Article 4 of the PAD regulation. What are these exceptions to disclosure? You can see them on screen. The legislator foresaw that there are specific exceptions to disclosure that protect specific interests. They are foreseen in Article 4 of the PAD regulation, and they have been further extensively interpreted by the Union courts over the years. As you can see from this slide, the exceptions cover a wide range of interests, from the protection of commercial interests of natural and legal persons, including intellectual property rights, to the protection of court proceedings, from privacy and integrity of individuals to the purpose of inspections. How does EFSA apply these exceptions? EFSA applies the exceptions in accordance with the settled case law of the European courts. In particular, the exceptions to disclosure are applied strictly as they constitute exception to the principle of the widest possible access to documents held by EU bodies. You might imagine that in view of the scope of EFSA's remit and activities, the exceptions that are more frequently encountered by EFSA are those relating to the protection of commercial interests, as well as the protection of privacy and integrity of individuals. But during the years, we had several instances in the past where also other exceptions, protection of court proceedings, protection of legal advice, were encountered and were taken into account when processing a PAD application. Now, in relation to the applicability of the exceptions, it is very important, and this is for the next slide, to underline the interplay between the PAD regulation and the Aarhus Regulation on the accessibility of environmental information. As briefly mentioned earlier, when we were setting the scene and considering the legal framework applicable to the PAD processing, when a PAD application relates to environmental information, EFSA applies the PAD regulation in conjunction with the Aarhus Regulation. In this respect, and very briefly, we shall take into account that Article 6.1 of the Aarhus Regulation establishes a legal presumption that an overriding public interest in disclosure shall be deemed to exist when the information requested relates to emissions into the environment, prevailing over some of the exceptions to disclosure, among which the protection of commercial interests. So by taking into in taking into consideration all these elements, EFSA assesses the application of the exceptions, assesses the accessibility of the documents, taking into consideration the exceptions, the Aarhus Regulation, and arrives to a decision. And here I want to underline a few aspects of one of the last steps of the processing of the initial applications, which is the preparation of the documents for release, which is very, very important. And it's a very interesting aspect of the processing. Following the assessment of the accessibility, if EFSA concludes that the concerned document shall be partially disclosed, it will proceed with the manual redaction of the documents. This implies that EFSA blackens in a permanent manner each element which shall not be disclosed in all the documents requested. We have a system in-house where we have some staff member blackening and then what we call the 4 eyes check. So we have other pair of eyes, other staff members checking the sanitization. In view of the principle of concrete and individual examination of the documents I highlighted above, and taking also into account the number of documents and pages falling within the scope of PAD application, this is a step of the process that can be resource intensive and a time-consuming exercise, and is extremely important. I want to alert just you on one aspect of it, because as I said, the sanitization occurs manually, so the documents are redacted manually. And as regards the reductions of personal data, there is a possibility that personal data are, of course, inadvertently disclosed to you. Always, EFSA, we always recommend in our letter to pay attention, and we recommend PAD applicants to treat any such residual personal data with utmost discretion. Now, with the next slide, I just would like to have spend a few words on the 2 other sections. Following the assessment of the accessibility of the requested documents, as well as their sanitization, EFSA will share its reply with the PAD applicants by means of a written referenced letter. This reply will be sent to you electronically to the email address you use to submit your PAD applications or via Connect.EFSA, as explained before. In this case, if you have used Connect.EFSA, you will receive a notification. The requested documents, in case EFSA decides to grant access to them in full or partial, are transmitted by electronic means via Connect.EFSA or via email. In case of a large number of documents, the documents will be transmitted via Microsoft OneDrive. In this last scenario, EFSA staff will contact you for further guidance on how to access the documents requested. In the event your PAD application is totally or partially rejected by EFSA and you are unsatisfied by our reply, you are entitled to submit a confirmatory application within 15 working days upon receipt of EFSA's decision. Confirmatory applications can be submitted via email, addressed to our head of unit, Dirk Detke, or via EFSA Connect.EFSA. I hope that this presentation has provided you with a good overview of the different steps of the processing of a PAD application, as outlined in the guidance. As you may have understood, the processing of PAD applications entails several different steps to be processed within the mandatory limits, so it's complex. Now, I would like just to share with you some takeaway that are important for you when submitting a PAD applications to allow us to be swifter, very swifter in the reply, to be and stay connected with you. First, be clear and precise. As I said before, if you're interested to receive certain data on a specific substance dating to 2018, ask for that. Don't ask for all data for all years. If you're interested on receiving a part of a dossier, ecotoxicological studies, don't ask for the whole dossier, ask for what you are more interested to. We are there to support you in clarifying, because you might think, I don't know what I'm interested because I don't know what are the documents. We are there. You can ask for clarifications and then we can provide you a list and then you can decide what is most interesting for you to receive. Read carefully. This is also a very important takeaway. Read carefully EFSA's communications to you. Very often when we reply, when we propose a first solution, when we want to clarify your PAD applications with you, we put it in our written communications to you. And sometimes we need to send reminders because possibly you don't see that the communications is there. So please, please read our communications to you until the end. And don't hesitate to come back to us spontaneously. We are there, we are a team to provide you support, to clarify the status of your requests, where we are, when we are going to reply, where is the status, helping you in being more efficient for you. I will now give the floor to Philip Answorth, who will provide you with an overview of some of the most recurrent issues we encountered when processing PAD applications. These are all detailed in the guidance that will be published, but at the same time, we wanted to have a special focus on them. So, Philip, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Luisa. Thanks very much for this. So my name is Philip Answorth, and I'm also working in the EFSA Public Access to Documents team. And today we're going to be talking a little bit about the recurrent issues. It's not possible to go through all the recurrent issues that we face during the processing of PAD applications in the short time that we have today, but we'd like to go through some of the main ones. So if we can go to the next slide. So the first recurrent issue that we have is on the consultations. This was touched on a little bit earlier, but we'd like to draw your attention here to two specific provisions of the PAD regulation, which is Article 4.4 and Article 4.5. So Article 4.4 is dealing with situations where EFSA receives a public access to documents request for documents which are originating from third parties. And this provision, it provides that there's a mandatory consultation process unless it's clear that the document shall or shall not be disclosed. So in general, when we deal with public access to documents request for documents originating from third parties, we will usually carry out a consultation, but there may be certain situations in which this does not apply. And then for Article 4.5, this is a very similar situation, but these documents are originating from member states. So here again, we will look to carry out the engagement with the member states, where we look to collect the feedback in terms of whether or not the document owner would see the applicability of any of the exceptions to disclosure outlined in Article 4. And in this context, it's important to note that we solicit the views of the third parties and the member states, but it's ultimately the responsibility of EFSA to take the decision in terms of the accessibility of certain information contained in requested documents by way of the PAD regulation. And the case law is very clear on this. There's not really a veto right, let's say, for member states or for third-party document owners for that matter. It's the responsibility of EFSA to take the final decision, taking into consideration the views received. So this is a bit the consultation process. That being said, there's many factors which which play a role in the carrying out of a successful consultation process. One of the issues which we experience a lot, and especially in cases where we have requests for very old documents, is difficulties in terms of finding an appropriate contact point. In this sense, if we have a very old document, it's possible that companies, they evolve in terms of personnel. People may leave a particular company, and also in terms of ownership, companies can also change hands. So when we have requests for very old documents, it can be quite difficult to identify an appropriate contact point within a company who is knowledgeable about the drawing up of a particular document requested and all of the background which goes with this. So this can be one particular recurrent issue which slows down the processing of PAD applications in terms of carrying out the consultation process. But once we find the appropriate contact point, this is by no means the end of the story. There's also other factors at play. So, for example, just because we find an appropriate contact point doesn't necessarily mean that that contact point is particularly familiar with the PAD framework. So a lot of the time, once we identify an appropriate contact point, we'll still need to perhaps carry out a meeting with the contact point in order to explain a little bit how the PAD regulation is working, in particular with regard to the exceptions to disclosure. Maybe they're not super familiar with this. A lot of the time, they might be familiar with other similar legal frameworks, such as in other jurisdictions, for example, Freedom of Information Acts, for example. But the PAD regulation, maybe they need a bit more guidance here in terms of what exactly is expected from them, in terms of identifying specific information which they may want to suggest should be protected, and grounding such claims in accordance with one of the specific exceptions to disclosure in the PAD regulation. So this is a recurrent issue which we often have. Which again can slow down the processing. And then on the other side of this, at the other end of the spectrum, we can also encounter situations where we carry out the consultation, and maybe we interact with a contact point who's particularly familiar with the PAD regulation. So perhaps it might be a consultant or a lawyer who's acting on behalf of a client, who are experts in the field. They're very familiar with the framework. They want to go through and carry out a sort of line-by-line assessment of all of the information in a particular requested document. Maybe they're justifying in a particularly detailed manner any claims which they put forward in accordance with one of the exceptions to disclosure of the PAD regulation. Maybe they're also referencing certain case law which interprets that exception to disclosure. So this can result in let's say a back and forth between EFSA and the third-party document owner or the representatives in the context of the consultation, which can again be a lengthy process which draws out the processing of PAD applications. In addition to this, there's also other certain practical elements. So Louisa talked a little bit earlier about Microsoft OneDrive. This is something which we use here at EFSA in order to transmit very large numbers of documents in a secure manner. So this has a password protection and also a two-factor authentication. But again, maybe people are not super familiar with this setup. So there might be a need for guidance here. And again, excuse me. Again, this may take some more time in the processing. So these are some of the regular issues which we occur in order to carry out a successful consultation, but not all consultations will actually be successful. So it might actually be impossible for EFSA to identify a correct contact point. And in these kind of situations, then EFSA needs to take a decision in terms of the accessibility, without necessarily having the full overview of the background information with respect to how a particular document was drawn up and in what context. So here it's not necessarily straightforward to arrive at a conclusion, and again this can result in a time-consuming process. So all of this to say, the consultations are particularly time-consuming. It's a recurrent issue which we have on the processing of most PAD applications. But in any case, when there is eventually a decision to release a particular document by way of the PAD regulation, we will always try to notify third-party document owners in advance of the transmission of the requested document, to a particular PAD applicant. And like this, the third-party documents owners, they're fully aware of the situations, and they can take any action that they may deem necessary before the planned release. So this is the first recurrent issue that we face in the processing of PAD applications, which is the consultations. And if we go to the next slide, please. Here we have the request for identity. So we talked a little bit about the consultation process, and what we found, especially in recent times, is in the context of carrying out the consultation process, we might receive the reply from the consulted third party in terms of substance. And in addition to submitting the reply, maybe they also submit a request to know the identity of the person who's actually behind a particular request. So the person who's interested in the documents which they submitted to EFSA. So what we will usually do in this situation is that EFSA will not usually be in a position to release the identity of individuals who are behind a particular request. This is because this information is personal data. Names of individuals would be constituting personal data. However, what we will try to do is look to release the affiliation of a particular individual. So the company or organization to which that individual is affiliated. This it wouldn't usually not be revealing any personal data. And this can be useful information to third-party document owners. So this is the general approach which we'll take. It's true that for certain situations, in particular, thinking of very small organizations, it might be not actually possible to release the name of a particular company, so the affiliation of an individual, without sort of inadvertently releasing the personal data of the individual concerned. If it's a very small company, maybe the name of the person is actually in the name of the company, for example. This could be a situation where we would actually not be in a position to release any information at all. This is just one example, but it could also be, let's say, a university where there's just one department, there's one expert in a particular field, and like this, it's impossible to give out any information without inadvertently identifying that particular individual. So in general, we'll look to release the affiliation, but it won't always be possible to do so. And in general, before the release of any affiliation, again, we'll try to notify the individual concerned who's submitting the request. And like this, they're fully aware of what's going on. So the message here is to be prepared. You know, this can happen, and you may receive a notification from EFSA that your affiliation is intended to be disclosed. So if we go to the next slide, please. So the next recurrent issue that we find is the need for clarity, and this really it has two elements. So the first element is that if a PAD request which we receive is unclear in terms of the actual documents which are being requested, so we're not able to identify any particular documents which are being requested by a particular requester. Here we need to respond by sending a formal request for clarification, where we asked for additional information in order to allow us to identify the documents which are being requested. And then we also need to wait for the reply. And then from the reply, often we can start to really make some progress with the processing. So this is to say that this kind of situation, it takes time because the clock starts to tick, but we're not in a position where we can really make sort of real concrete progress with the processing. So the message here would be, please try to be as clear as possible in terms of the identification of the documents which you're requesting. And then there's also the second element to this, which is maybe it is possible for EFSA to identify certain documents which are being requested. but at the same time, it may not be possible to identify any sort of specific interest within a sort of very large number of documents which are being requested. In this situation, it might not be possible to process all of the documents which are being requested, notwithstanding the fact that we have a clear identification of those documents. And in this kind of situation, it might be difficult for us to sort of know where to begin to process. Within a situation where, okay, we have a clear identification of the documents requested, they're very large, and we also have a clear identification of the interest behind the particular request. Like this, we know where to start with the processing. We know which documents to prioritize, even if maybe we're not in a position to process all of the documents which are requested. So again, it would be a message to requesters to please be as clear as possible in terms of the documents which you're requesting, and to the extent that you're comfortable with, please try to also list a little bit the priority documents from your side. It's true that there's no obligation for you to identify the motivation behind your request, but to the extent that you're comfortable with, it would help EFSA in terms of the processing if you can identify your priority documents, let's say, to the extent that that requesters are comfortable with. So if we can go to the next slide. And this would be another recurrent issue which we're often faced within the processing of PAD requests. And this is the reuse of documents which are released by way of the PAD regulation. So here, the first thing to highlight would be Article 16 of the PAD regulation, which provides that the PAD regulation is without prejudice to any existing rules on copyright, which may limit a third party's right to reproduce or exploit any released documents. So purely for the purposes of this webinar, just for informational purposes only, maybe we can think about copyright as an IP right, a particular IP right, which conveys a sort of exclusivity right on the reuse of artistic and literary works, which can also be works relative to science, for the benefit of the authors of such artistic and literary works, which is subject to certain limitations. So, for example, the work concerned, it must be the original creation of the author, in the sense that if there's no originality, then the work it won't benefit from copyright protection. And then another important thing to point out on copyright would be that it's not necessary for this right to be sort of registered with any formal competent authority here. This is a right which it comes into existence just by the mere creation of this original artistic and literary work, including works relative to science. And an additional point to mention would be that copyright is also not a concept which is fully harmonized in EU law. So the member states are competent to legislate in this field. So there can be sort of significant differences across the different member states in terms of the particular protection which a document may or may not benefit from. So this is a little bit just in general terms copyright. But this is not the only IP right which might be relevant for a particular document. Here we're thinking also maybe of trade secrets, proprietary data, etc. So ultimately, the important thing to remember is that it's the responsibility of the recipients of any documents by way of the PAD regulation to respect these limitations. And in this respect, because each situation will require a case-by-case assessment, EFSA recommends that any recipients of documents, if there's any doubts as regards to the reuse of documents received, that the requesters, they reach out directly to the third-party document owners. And this will allow you to clarify any permissions or limitations which may be existing there. And then just to mention that besides the IP rights, there's also the certain data protection provisions in the sectoral legislation relevant to EFSA. So here, if a particular document is used for the benefit is used to support a particular application, there may be certain data protection provisions in some sectoral legislations to prevent the reuse of that document for the benefit of another applicant within a certain time period. So this is also something to watch out for here. So with this, we conclude the recurrent issues, which we wanted to highlight in this webinar. And with this, I pass the floor back to my colleague, Setlali Pintado, who will go through the question and answers with you. So Setlali, over to you.
Thank you very much, Phil, for this presentation on the regular issues we encounter when processing PAD applications. Now we would like to dedicate some time to the questions you submitted during the registration phase and during the webinar, the online session of this morning. Next slide, thanks. So for your information, so far you have been 236 persons registering to this webinar, and we thank you very much for your great interest and engagement in this process. We received so far during the registration process more than 80 comments and questions in total. Many of the comments we received related to your expectations on this webinar, so we hope we have addressed your needs by means of the previous presentation. The questions you submitted have been grouped in sections of the guidance for the PAD applicant that will be soon published on EFSA's website. Yeah, we noticed that the majority of the topics of your questions concerned the submission phase, the use of Connect.EFSA, the processing of the PAD application of your PAD applications, and the disclosure of documents following the EFSA's assessment. Therefore, we trust that we have addressed the questions on the processing and the submission by means of this webinar. We will now focus on specific topics that were recurrent questions we collected prior to the webinar, since we consider they are relevant for all the audience this morning. Next slide. The first question that comes back regularly is what kind of documents can be requested. And in this regard, it is important to start by looking at what is the definition of a document in the PAD regulation itself, in accordance to the definition that is laid down in Article 3A of the PAD regulation. As you can see, it's a very broad definition of any content, whatever its medium, written or paper or stored in electronic form or as a sound, visual or audiovisual recording, concerning a matter relating to the policies, activities and decisions falling within the institution's sphere of responsibility. So focusing now on EFSA's work, EFSA's spheres of responsibility. This means that basically you can request access to documents in any area of EFSA's work as defined in Articles 22 and 23 of EFSA's founding regulation, Regulation 178 of 2002. Inter alia, this can be documents on feed additive, chemical occurrence data, food consumption data, pesticides, novel foods, genetically modified organisms, food contact materials, nutrition, and so on and so forth. To give you a better overview of the documents concerned by PAD applications, please note that there are multiple types of documents within the activities of EFSA. First, there are the documents that EFSA produces by means of the mandates that are put forward in the union legislation. This can be scientific opinions, scientific outputs, reports, external reports that EFSA is producing, in generally proactively publishing by means of the obligations that are coming from Article 38 of EFSA's founding regulation. Then there are the second category of documents, which are the documents EFSA receives within in the framework of its activities. As a result of the collaboration EFSA has with other risk assessment bodies. Yeah, these documents can be, for example, applications dossier that food business operators submit to EFSA in the context of sectoral union legislation, which foresees, for example, for the authorization procedure involving EFSA for the risk assessment part. Is also documents that EFSA receives together with mandates from the Commission or risk managers to produce scientific outputs. But there can be also scientific study reports, additional data submitted by food business operators in the context of the so-called stop the clock procedures when EFSA is asking for additional information in the framework of risk assessment procedures. But these can be also documents that EFSA receives in the context of its activities, such as the draft assessment reports and the renewal assessment reports in the pesticides area. Normally, these documents are also published. Then last, PAD applications can also concern communications, such as emails, letters, and so on. So to sum up, there can be all documents that EFSA holds, that EFSA has in its possession, okay, in the framework of its activity. We receive questions, for example, what if you don't have the document? If we don't have the document, we will try to inform the PAD applicant who owns the document and try to redirect to the PAD applicant to the right owner of the document. If the document does not exist, in that case, we will also inform the PAD applicants that the document does not exist because it was not produced. Next slide. Another question we received is who can initiate a PAD applicant? Who can submit a PAD application? This question is addressed by also the PAD regulation, particularly Article 2.1 of the PAD regulation, which details who are the beneficiaries of this regulation, which are any citizens of the Union or any natural or legal person residing or having its registered office in a member state has the right to access a document. Now, what this means concretely, yeah, that PAD applicants can be very diverse. They can be natural persons like citizens, like persons residing in the EU that are not necessarily citizens. There can be legal persons like law firms in representation of their clients, non-governmental organizations that are also interested in accessing documents from EFSA. There can be students, academia, universities, food business operators, or consultancies. As you can see, if you are a non-resident of the EU or you are not and you are not a citizen of the EU, you, of course, can submit a request for access to document. However, strictly speaking, the PAD regulation does not apply to the processing of this request. However, please consider that as a courtesy, EFSA is extending this right to access to documents to non-EU residents and citizens, while not being legally obliged to do so. Next slide. We also received questions on who can be these document owners, that EFSA is consulting regularly in the processing of requests for access to documents. Since the scope of documents that can be requested is very broad, as you saw from the previous slide, the categories of documents owners are also very diverse. There can be other union institutions, bodies, agencies, institutions of the European Union, but there can be also member states with which we are interacting on a regular basis for risk assessment activities. There can be national competent authorities submitting data to EFSA, or national competent authorities contributing to the network activities of EFSA, or member states authorities carrying out risk assessment activities like EFSA. Of course, documents can also be produced by EFSA, as I explained before. So we are also document owner, but also the food business operators submitting applications dossier for placing in the union market food feed substances, products, or claims. There can be also the authors of studies or any other natural or legal person having a relationship with a food business operator. For example, the document owner can be a producer, an importer, or a laboratory, for example, having produced a document that then is submitted to EFSA in the context of an authorization procedure. We hope to have addressed your main questions on this, and I will now pass the floor to my colleague Louisa Venier, who will then take now the questions that we receive live during this webinar. Some of them were already addressed in the chat live, but other questions will be addressed now orally by my colleague Louisa, who will also conclude this webinar. Thank you very much for your attention. Louisa, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Citlali. Thanks a lot, Philip. Thanks a lot also to all participants for the active involvement and many questions we received. We tried live to respond to as many questions as possible. I think by means of the presentations, but also by means of the chat, we were very active in typing. I think we have addressed many of them. I can see now scrolling down that possibly there are a few that I try to tackle now. Again, one of the requests for affiliation. Philip was explaining it before. We protect, so when we receive when a PAD application is submitted and we perform the consultation, we always in the consultation process and in consultation communication, we inform normally the consulted third party about the category to which the PAD applicants belongs. So at a very high level, we say private organization, academia, or we tend to say NGOs. If this is not sufficient, of course, you can always ask for the affiliation and the identity. I can tell you already that the identity per se is absolutely personal data. So I will not give normally access unless there are specific conditions to my name if the PAD applicant. So I will not say it's Louisa Venier, but the fact that I belong to a public organization or the affiliation EFSA will be released. This allows me also to go through another question on the protection of personal data. Of course, as I said before, it's a case-by-case assessment. So if the PAD application concerns a document that contains therein personal data, and personal data, we take the definition of the EU GDPR Article 3, we take all the articles and all the provisions relating to the EU GDPR for the transmission of personal data. So it means that the transmission of personal data shall be protected unless there is a sound justification, what we call the necessity test, put forward by the requester for the transmission of the personal data. So in concrete, if someone asks for a document containing personal data enjoys full protection. Absolute protection is considered by the PAD regulation, unless the requester provides a sound justification for the transfer of this personal data via the application of Article 9 of the EU GDPR. And in this specific case, EFSA will assess this sound justification against the legitimate interest for protection of the data subject and take a conclusion. I saw another question on the use of functional mailboxes. Of course, the functional mailbox remains alive. So we have Connect.EFSA presented extensively in this webinar, but the functional mailbox and the possibility to submit PAD applications and communicate with our team via the functional mailbox that has been posted in chat is always valid and alive, so don't hesitate to use it as a means for submitting your PAD applications and communicating with us. Then scrolling down in the chat, I see certain, because we are really running out of time, I see that there are certain questions more specific on specific areas, pesticides, the application of the Aarhus Regulation. I think we touch upon them. If you consider also in view of the timing that we didn't specifically address your concern, Don't hesitate to write to us so we can come back to you on your specific query, which if it's very specific and on a specific case, of course, will be answered separately. And with this, I will say that we have arrived at the end of our webinar. I hope this event provided you with a good overview of our work in this transparency remit, a good overview of the guidance that again will be posted, will be published on our website together with this webinar presentation, and of our tools that allow us to provide you with an enhancement for the processing of PAD applications at EFSA. I would like to thank all the speakers for their contribution, and really I would like to thank you all for the participation to do this webinar and wish you a nice remaining part of the day. Thank you.